Good morning, everyone. My name is Liem, and I'm glad that you're able to join me today to learn more about 3D animation and visual effects. I'm curious, when you guys hear 3D animation and visual effects, what do you think of? What are some examples that you've seen where 3D is used? Just raise your hands and yell it out and I'll say it. Yes?
Toy Story.
Yes, Toy Story, that's a good one. That's one of the first, if not the first movie that uses 3D animation completely. Yes? IMAX, yes, they do have some movies. Can you think of anything else besides movies that use 3D or visual effects? Yes, that's a big one. Video games. The video game industry is actually much bigger than the movie industry. Although you might not hear so much about video games, they make tons more money than Hollywood movies do. And in fact, a game that came out 2 years ago called Call of Duty by itself has made more money in the first few weeks of sales than any other movie, book, play, or piece of entertainment combined. So the video game industry is a big one too. Anyone else? Yes? Yep, TV commercials, that's a good one. Anytime you see a commercial for things like the Gillette Mock Razor where it shows a close-up of the blades cutting off the hairs, that's an example of 3D. Anyone else? Another big one, yes, go ahead. Yes, that's currently where I work, and landscape architecture and architecture is a big one. They use 3D a lot in their building designs and city planning. Some other examples are mobile games, mobile apps on your phone, interactive kiosks, websites. If you go to IKEA's website, for example, they have this neat little section where you can build a room and then place their furniture, move it around, place doors and windows, change colors, and that's all using 3D. Education, there's a lot of 3D uses in the classrooms and anatomy, biomedical research, and recently there's new technology called 3D printing, where now if you create something in a 3D software, there's actually a machine that will actually spit out a physical representation of that thing that you've created in the virtual world, so you can actually hold it in your hands. So that's a really neat and new technology that's just coming around. So as I've mentioned, I'm currently working for Scatliff Miller & Murray, which is one of the city's largest landscape architectural firms. And my job there is to sit down with architects and designers, engineers, and bring their visions to life. They might have an idea for a new building or a new park or a new bridge, and they'll design it on paper or design it in AutoCAD. They'll have drawings from the plan view, elevations, schematics, basically a lot of drawings, a lot of measurements. And when they show those drawings to the general public, people kind of just scratch their heads because they don't understand, like, what are all these lines? What are all these numbers? So part of my job is to take all of that information and then using 3D software, and in my case, I use one called 3D Studio Max, to build that bridge or that building or that park, build it in a virtual space, and then apply colors and materials and details like benches or people, trees, planting, and then add realistic lights to the scene. And then once we have that as a 3D model, we can show that off to the public on the news or at open houses, and then they can see what the design looks like even years before it's ever constructed. So that's my job at Scatliff Miller & Murray. And the advantages of doing things in 3D is that you have a lot of flexibility. Say, for example, they come up with a design, and if you go straight into building it and you realize there's a mistake, then you have to go back and redo it, and that costs a lot of time and money. Whereas if you do it in 3D and you build it accurately to real-world measurements, you can spot mistakes early on and then fix it in the 3D software really quickly and easily, and it doesn't really cost anything. Another advantage of doing things in 3D is that it's interactive. Once you have the 3D model, and I'll show you in a second, you can spin it around, you can zoom in, zoom out, you can turn things on and off, and basically you can analyze it from any angle, any perspective, and all you need to do is build it once. And lastly, with 3D, another advantage is that it looks very realistic. Like someone mentioned Toy Story early on, that came out years ago, and since then, 3D has come a long way. If you watch a lot of movies today, there's special effects where you won't even know that it's a special effect because it's so realistic. And the role of 3D in movies has evolved as well. Nowadays, a lot of things, a lot of special effects, visual effects are done in 3D that are not possible in the real world. For example, when I was your age in school, a movie that had just come out was Jurassic Park. And previous to that, there was not really a lot of 3D used in movies, and there was no way of creating these realistic dinosaurs. So 3D came along, and it provided the filmmakers the ability to create stuff that just doesn't exist. And another use of 3D in movies is that you can create stuff that is either too expensive to film in real life or too dangerous to film in real life. Like the scene in Titanic where the ship breaks in two and people are falling off the top. Originally, they tried filming that with real actors, but on the first day of shooting, there were so many injuries that they realized it wasn't safe to do it. So what they did was they used 3D software to create those people, to create the ship, and it saved a lot of people from getting injured or possibly killed. And someone mentioned previs. Previs is taking storyboards one step further. How many of you here have heard of storyboards? Do you know what those are? Okay, that's good. When you're making a movie, before you film anything, you have to draw it out on paper, kind of like a comic book. And each drawing tells the actor and the director and the crew how to set it up and what to do. And what 3D allows is it takes it one step further. You take those storyboards and you animate them really quickly, just with really rough characters, really rough sets. And that allows you to block out all of your timing and work out any issues that you might have. So that's what previs is. And a lot of movies, especially movies with special effects, use previs. And if you watch DVDs or Blu-rays of movies that come out, there's typically special features that allow you to see what the previs looks like. And you can compare the previs to the final product to see how similar it is. I'll take a break and quickly show you the 3D software that I use and the fundamentals of it, how it works, and I'll show you some examples of projects I've done. So this right here is called 3D Studio Max. It's an industry standard. A lot of companies use it throughout all of their different fields. This is used for architecture. It's really common in video games and in films as well. So in this window here, you have your top view. So anything you create in this window, you're looking at it straight down. This window here is your front view. So you're looking at it from the front, and this is the left, and this is your window that you can move around in. And since you're working in a 3D space, it's important to have all those views because you need to see it from all those angles. If you're using a program like Photoshop, you're only looking at it from that one angle ever, so it's not as important, but this is the 4 views. So we'll quickly throw in an object. We'll just make a box. So there we have our box. And here we see we'll zoom in. In our top view, that's what it looks like. In our front view, and this is our left view. And this is the view that we can rotate around. And we'll just add in some more objects. We'll throw in a sphere. We'll throw in a cylinder and a cone. So fundamentally, all of those examples of 3D that we talked about start off like this. Just simple objects in 3D space. Here you see them from the top, from the front, from the side, and from perspective. Now, in 3D space, once we've created those objects, we have the ability to change their properties. We can make them smaller, or we can make them larger, we can make them taller, or we can make them shorter, right? There we go. And we can move them around, so we'll move this guy back here, move this guy up, move this guy down, move this guy around. So we can scale them, we can move them, and lastly, we can rotate them. So this box we can spin around, this we can spin around as well, this we can spin around. So those are the three things that we can apply to these objects. And not only can we move them, we can animate them. Now, my background, my traditional education was actually classical animation. And what that means is, if you look at the old Disney movies where it's drawn on paper or on cells, there's 24 drawings per second. So if you're watching something like Disney's Beauty and the Beast, every second of screen time that you see, someone has drawn 24 drawings and colored those in. And 3D works in a very similar way, because to get the illusion of movement, you need at least 24 drawings per second. So in the past, we had to draw all those drawings by hand. What 3D allows now, I'm just going to zoom in here. I'm going to get rid of these objects just to simplify it. What 3D has allowed is it will automatically draw in those 24 drawings for you. You just need to tell it where the first drawing is and where the last drawing is, and it automatically will fill in those drawings. So if I turn on the animate key here, and I tell it, for the first drawing, let's have the box over here. And then down here is my timeline, so I'll move it to 24, so that represents 1 second. And then I'll move the box over to here. So now, if we press play, there you go. So there's a really simple animation. The computer, what it has done, has interpolated those keyframes. So here's the first frame, here's the last one, and it's drawn in all those frames, and it's saved a lot of time, because I would have had to spend like hours drawing all these. And it can record those different properties as well, such as rotation and scale. So for example, if I start this over here really big, and then I move to the end and make it really small, now it automatically records that as well. And lastly, if I start this upright, and then over here I spin it around, then it does all those automatically. So that is the fundamentals of 3D. Everything that you see in video games, movies, commercials, use this principle. And since we've been doing it for a very long time, we add more details to it. So this is an example of a project. So remember those simple boxes and cylinders and spheres that we started off with? This is the same thing. Started off with those and just kept adding more and more detail and more objects until you build your model. So this is a model in 3D space. You can zoom in, zoom out. Again, you can view it from the top, like this. You can view it from the front, and you can view it from the side. So once we have our model, something else we can do is called rigging. And this is a whole nother subset of jobs within the 3D industry. So this is our model. When we create our model, it's in a static pose. And in order to move it, what we have to do is we have to create a skeleton for it. So once we have the skeleton and we move the skeleton around, you can see that the model moves together with that skeleton. See. And then again, you would turn on the animate button and set all those keyframes, and the computer would draw in those keyframes for you. So that's an example. An example of 3D for architecture. I'll show you really quick. Now, this is a project that we did at Scatliffe, Miller, and Murray a few years ago. The client was Winnipeg Airports Authority, and at the time, they only had the old terminal, and they were planning a bunch of new buildings, such as this Standard Aero Edition, the Greyhound Terminal, the Canada Post building, and a hotel and a parkade, and the new airport terminal. So they had all of these different designers and architects working, and they didn't have a good idea or a clear understanding of what the space would look like once all of these buildings were done. And that was years and years down the road. So what they asked us to do was to take all of those blueprints, create a 3D model of it, and then animate a camera flying around the space so that we can get a sense of what the campus, the new campus, would look like. So as you can see here, we saw the video start off from the air, so that's what it would look like as you're flying in or flying out. And then here's the proposed site for the hotel, and then we just passed the new parkade, and this is the new terminal. So when we had it as a 3D model, it really helped the public understand what was being planned. As a tool for landscape architecture, the 3D is really helpful as well, because one of the things it allows us to do is create realistic lighting scenarios. So for example, if I enter in the exact longitude and latitude of this location and the exact date, it can calculate where the sun is located at any time during the day, and it can calculate the rays of light that are cast from the sun and the shadows. So if we put in this building and run that simulation, it can tell us the shadows will be, for example, this long, and for what periods of the day. And that helps us determine what sorts of planting we can put there and how they'll survive, because they need a certain amount of light throughout the day. So this is an example of 3D for landscape architecture. I'll run a slideshow of images that are examples of projects that I've done throughout the years. And during that time, I'll go over a bit of my education and some of the places that I've worked for before Scatliffe, Miller, and Murray. And then I'll open it up for questions if you have any. So I'll just run this slideshow here. Before joining Scatliffe, Miller, and Murray, I had the opportunity to work for a variety of companies. One of them was Frantic Films, which is a local studio here. They did visual effects for big Hollywood movies such as X-Men, The Matrix Reloaded, The Italian Job, The Core, Superman Returns, Catwoman, a lot of comic book movies, a lot of action movies. We also did some video games. We worked on EA's Need for Speed. I did some stuff for Ghost Recon 2. And since then, I've also done some TV commercials and TV shows for Space Channel, Discovery Channel, HGTV. If you've seen Deck Wars or Mike Holmes shows, anytime that they cut to a 3D sequence where it shows the deck being constructed or the room being redesigned. That's all 3D. A question I often get is, how did I get into 3D and visual effects in the first place? Well, growing up in Winnipeg, especially with minus 40-degree winters, is not an uncommon thing. And as cheesy as this may sound, I first started doing 3D just to stay warm. My school, every time lunch break came around, we were kicked out and we had to go outside and play in the snow. And the other alternative was to sit in the computer lab and play around on the computers. And at that time, there was this one computer back in the corner that had this program installed on it called Infinity. And that was my first exposure to 3D. And I was just amazed at how this little program gave me, as an artist, the ability to create anything that I could imagine. And that's where I started. In high school back then, there weren't animation classes, there wasn't this career symposium, there wasn't a lot of information out there for 3D because it was just really a developing technology. So the first step for me was simply to gather as much research as I could. I went to the library, I looked up animation books, history of animation, fine arts, history of art. I went to the video store, rented a bunch of animation movies. We have a great National Film Board headquarters right here in Winnipeg. There's a lot of classically trained animators here that I met up with and talked with. At the time, we had something called the Manitoba Society of Independent Animators. So basically, I just wanted to soak in as much information as I could. For you guys these days, there's an abundance of information. There's a lot of trade magazines that you can find in chapters that talk about 3D visual effects, animation. There's 3D World, there's Cinefex. All those magazines and books tell you pretty much everything that goes on behind the making of a movie or commercials and video games. Some other software packages that are really good to know if you want to get into this field, besides 3D Studio Max, the alternative is something called Maya or Softimage. Those are the three big ones that a lot of the studios use. You saw that the model had colors and textures on it, so it's really handy to know Photoshop as well for creating those textures. And once you create a render like this, for example, you might want to touch it up, you might want to brighten certain areas or change the colors. So that's where Photoshop is really handy. So learning Photoshop is good. If you're rendering animations and videos, video editing software is good to know. Personally, I use After Effects and Premiere, but there's also Final Cut Pro and some of the higher end packages like Inferno or Flame. But at the end of the day, all of that technology, all of that software is just like another tool. And it comes down to you as the artist to use it, just like a pencil or a paintbrush, really. What would I say are the pros and cons of the job? Well, with any other type of job, there's both pros and cons. When I was working with visual effects for those bigger Hollywood movies, we had a lot of time to work on them. We had probably 2 years almost to do one film. And that worked out to maybe 2 or 3 months per shot of the movie. So, for example, when I was working on The Core, there was a 3-second shot that just showed lava breaking through the ground and pouring down. And literally we had 3 months just to work on those few seconds of animation. But, well, I guess the advantage is that you really get a chance to perfect the art. You get a chance to make it look really nice. The downside, though, is that you're working on the same thing for 3 months and it gets really tedious. And plus, the director or producer is always changing their minds, so you have to follow what they're asking for and make changes all the time. With video games and TV commercials, for example, or advertising, the deadlines and turnaround times are much shorter. So a commercial might only last, the production might only be a few weeks. So you get a chance to work on a lot of different things. But the downside to that is the really fast turnaround time. So the deadline, the crunch, it's really stressful. In case you guys are interested in knowing what the starting salary of a 3D artist is, you can find all of that information in those magazines that I was telling you about. But I'll tell you, when I started as a junior 3D animator here in Winnipeg about 12, 13 years ago, the starting pay was $30,000 a year. And since then, it's gone up. It's closer to an average of $45,000 a year now. But a lot of factors come in as well, such as your training, your experience, the skill set you know, and where you actually live. So for example, if you live in one of the bigger cities like Toronto or Vancouver or somewhere in the States, you can command a lot higher salary. Some of my friends who work for the bigger studios in Toronto and Vancouver, it's not uncommon for them to be making $80,000 a year. If you guys are interested in learning more about 3D and visual effects, or are considering a career or post-secondary education in this field, I highly recommend the course offered at Red River College. And in fact, today they have a display booth on the 3rd floor in the main hallway. It's a 2-year diploma, and it covers a lot of the things that I just talked about today. The instructors who teach it are friends and colleagues of mine who I've worked together on those movies. So you're getting actual hands-on training with industry veterans. And it covers things like mobile design and development, digital video, 3D animation, motion graphics, and graphic design. And when you graduate from that course, you are equipped with the skills to be able to go out and work. Like some of their graduates right now work for video game companies here in the city. Lastly, what I wanted to talk about is one of the biggest challenges that you face in the career of animation and visual effects is the peer competition. Today, there are a lot of animators out there that you're competing with for the same jobs and same positions. But why not use that to your advantage? Building good relationships, collaborating, and learning from others is a key to being successful in this career and in this industry. This may sound cliche, but it's true. The 3D industry is actually a fairly tightly knit community, and you run into the same people all the time. With video games and movies, since each project lasts anywhere between a few months to a year, when that project is over, generally the people who work on it move on to other projects, usually in other studios. So there's a lot of moving around in the industry. You get to meet and work with a lot of different people. So it's really important not to burn any of those bridges. It's really important to do social networking, and you might receive recommendations from fellow animators. So whenever I get a chance, I try to meet up with new people and work with them and share my education and experience and knowledge. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today, to talk to you guys. And that's my presentation. It was a pleasure and an honor to get this chance to talk to you.